The entire ship's company was awake on the morning of May 7th, for a good hour before dawn. We had been steaming northward at a steady clip all night long, and every man knew that we were within range of an enemy force as powerful as our own. We had no way of knowing whether they had been aware of our presence the afternoon before. We rather suspected they had, and they too might well be planning to make the same sort of dawn attack we would attempt. All the plans, however, for getting the dive bomber and torpedo bomber squadrons off early fell through. Our scouts, off and ranging the surrounding sea in the half-light before sunup, could find no trace of the Japanese. Their precision quartering of the sea still was bringing no results at 7 a.m., and they were beginning to get out toward the limit of their ranges, which also was toward the maximum limit of our squadron's fighting distances. "The Japanese could not have seen us and run away," one officer told me. "We are in their waters, and they will want to press the attack first if they can. They probably missed us entirely, and during the night turned aside to go in some direction that has taken them outside our zone of search." His estimate, I thought, was probably correct, but it turned out that we were both wrong. "Gangster near fleet," came a radio call about 7:30 from a fighter plane of Carrier 2. "It is a Kawanishi snooper," the same pilot reported a few seconds later. If we could see the snooper, certainly the snooper could see us, and unquestionably by this time his radio men had reported our presence to the Japanese fleet and possibly to the land plane base whence this long-range craft had come. "Well, we are in the soup," one of the boys opined. "The Japanese know where we are, and we have not found them. If they are as good as they are supposed to be, they will be taking off right now to give us a pasting." The fighters, after sighting the Kawanishi, were talking back and forth among themselves, and we were following their progress aboard the Lexington. Within a few moments we heard one airman say, "Well, there he goes." The locale of such fights, often at heights from 10,000 feet upward, is seldom certain. This time we discovered where the snooper had been flying when our own lookouts reported that a plane was burning and falling several miles away on our starboard beam. We could all see the ship, and it seemed to be spinning slowly down from a great height. It took a long time to reach the sea and left a vertical trail of smoke like a comet. We could follow it right down to the water with our eyes. There was the usual burst of flame when it hit, and then more smoke. By that time, however, we had moved on, and the smoke plume was behind us. "At any rate, we got into them first," was the deck crew's summation. About 8 o'clock, a long-range scout from Carrier 2 called his vessel Japanese Fleet, 1 carrier, 3 heavy cruisers, 6 destroyers, 180 miles, course 120, speed 20 knots, west-northwest. Quick glances at our charts showed us the enemy was about 50 miles north of Mishima. We were standing a little south of the island of Rossel. The scout's cryptic language indicated that the Japanese were 180 miles from us, and that they then were steering a course of 120 degrees at a 20-knot speed. From the scout's report, it was evident that the Japanese fleet had split up. On the previous evening, the Lexington's scouts had seen a flotilla of 2 carriers, 5 cruisers, and a dozen destroyers. Possibly this force split during the night into 2 formations with 1 carrier to each group. Much later, we learned that General MacArthur's bombers claimed to have sighted and attacked a single Japanese carrier on this date. It is possible that the land planes saw and hit the second Japanese carrier from this force. That could be very likely if the second carrier, which disappeared during the night, had steered a westerly course, taking it over toward Deboyne Island. At any rate, the carrier, the Ryukaku the Navy later said it was, which our scouts found that morning, had suffered no attack until our squadrons reached it. Furthermore, there were no army planes around while this attack was on, and the Ryukaku sank before our last planes left the scene. But to go back to the Lexington again, our pilots were all set for takeoff at the time the Japanese fleet's location was pinpricked on our charts. A few minutes were required for our navigators to plot the courses our squadrons should fly to intercept the Japanese, and to chalk this and some last-minute weather information on the ready-room blackboard. Our meteorological officer, Lieutenant G.L. Raring, kept this weather information up to date, and it was unusually complete. That morning, I remember, he had the direction and velocity of the wind at 1,000-foot levels, right up to the maximum heights to which our planes could climb. He also predicted that the overcast which spread over our general area would dwindle away to nothing by the time they were passing along the coasts of the island of Tagula, and they would find the Japanese in the clear under perfect flying conditions. Also on the blackboard were instructions to the pilots concerning the course and speed the Lexington would follow for the next 3 hours. This was information they would require when they started home, and Captain Sherman always religiously adhered to exactly the speeds and compass headings he had given the pilots before they left. Such matters are vital to men going out to battle, because the ship might move 60 nautical miles from her position at the time of their takeoffs during that 3-hour interval. Getting all this information to the pilots and stowing them into their aircraft required only 20 minutes, and not more than 30 had elapsed by the time the last of the airstriking group was speeding on its way. In all, 76 airplanes were sent off. They consisted of 24 torpedo planes and 36 scouts and dive bombers, most of which were carrying a 1,000-pound bomb load. A few of the scouts carried one 500-pounder and two 100-pounders. Finally, there was a unit of 16 fighter planes to escort the others and to deal with the Japanese fighter plane defences. Hardly had our attack squadrons cleared the deck when the scouts reappeared with landing gear and hook down. This was the unspoken signal that they wanted to come aboard. The first crew in reported that they had been in combat over the Japanese formation. Biplane float fighters had intercepted them, and they were forced to shoot their way out. None of the scouts was lost, and they managed to shoot down 2 of these interfering Japanese. There was no sign, they said, of any of the Zero monoplane fighters from the Japanese carriers. The bombing, torpedo plane and fighter formations, meanwhile, were climbing up to cruising altitude. Flying through the overcast, they levelled off in clear air. In a few minutes they passed the edge of the cloud layer, as Lieutenant Raring had predicted they would, and from there on the trip was made in cloudless skies with visibility as wide as 60 miles. Lieutenant Commander Weldon Hamilton, the dive bomber skipper, was at the front of his formation, which had climbed up to 15,000 feet and was slightly ahead and above Dixon's scout bombers, who were at 12,000. Underneath these 2 groups were Brett's torpedo planes. The fighters had split up, 4 pairs in the high-level group flying slightly above and behind Hamilton, and the other 4 idling along with the torpedo squadron. Our course led us along the island of Tagula for 60 miles, Hamilton later told me. From our height in the clear air, this island with its coral reefs, its tiny eights with the breakers combing over them like whipped cream, was a sight to behold. The blue of the sea, the green of the island, and the cream and silver of the surf and sand were truly magnificent. After we had passed Tagula, we went northward to bring us past the eastern tip of Mishima. The flight up to that point had been uneventful, but now we were within 30 miles of where the enemy should be. A few minutes later, we were over the area where we expected to find them, so I began to search the horizon with my powerful binoculars. Visibility was remarkable, the sky cloudless, and eventually I found, almost 40 miles to the eastward, at right angles to our course, a number of thin white hairs on the blue sea. A careful look at these showed them to be the wakes of the Japanese fleet we were seeking. I radioed to the other squadron commanders, and we all altered course to fly toward them. Little was said over the air, Hamilton told me. When I first sighted the enemy, I radioed, "Bob from Ham, Bob from Ham." He was calling Commander Bob Dixon, who was leading the scout bombers. "Enemy ships sighted 20 miles north of our present position." I underestimated the actual distance. At that time, I could only see those white wakes in the light blue distance. Bob sent a message to Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Brett, Torpedo Squadron skipper. "Did you get that, Jimmy?" When Jimmy said yes, but he could not see them, Bob said, "I will coach you in, boy." He did that as soon as he was able to sight the enemy. Remember, Bob was somewhat lower than I was and had no binoculars. When I was finally able to distinguish the ships, I recognized the carrier from the reflection of the sun on its light-colored flight deck. I then radioed, "I see one flat top." Then Bob saw it. Little else was said that I remember until after the attack. There was some fighter talking about Japanese seaplane fighters, which I did not pay much attention to. I came out of the sun and almost exactly downwind, and commenced my attack immediately after Bob Dixon's squadron was finished. The Japanese had made a turn to the left as Dixon's crew attacked. They made a second turn while I was waiting for our torpedo planes to take station for their coordinated attack with us. I went down at the start of the third turn the carrier made. The torpedo squadron attacked at the same time. We began from 16,500 feet and pushed over in our dive at 12,000. The Japanese was exactly downwind as I nosed down, simplifying my problem tremendously. My bomb, which was the first 1,000-pounder to hit, struck in the middle of the flight deck's width, just abaft amidships. As I looked back, the entire after portion of the flight deck was ablaze and pouring forth heavy black smoke. Pulling up, I heard Bob's voice on the radio. "Mighty fine, mighty fine." Watching the rest of my squadron come down, I observed some of the boys missing the carrier with their bombs. I called them on the radio saying, "Use the wind, boys, use the wind," because their bombs were hitting downwind of the ship. My rear gunner told me later that a Japanese fighter followed me in my dive and made 3 attacks on my plane after the pullout, but evidently his guns had jammed as my gunner never saw him fire. At that time I was a sitter, as I did not know he was there and was busy watching the Japanese carrier exploding. My radio man believes he disabled the Japanese but did not actually see him crash. During their dives, rear gunners in my squadron definitely got 2 Japanese fighters which attacked them. The attack on this Japanese carrier should go down in naval history as a most successful coordinated dive-bombing torpedo attack. The 2 coordinating squadrons, VB-2 and VT-2, did not lose a single plane. The arrival of the squadrons over the Japanese was also recounted by Lieutenant Commander Bob Dixon, who that day was leading his scouts as dive bombers. These were the planes with single 500 and 2 100-pound bombs. We came over at 12,000 feet. Enemy fighter patrols were in the air, but they barely reached us as we eased off into our almost vertical dives. To be really effective against dive bombers, fighter planes have to reach them before they get to the turnover point. Ordinarily, fighters cannot stay with us in the dive because with our air brakes we keep our speed at about 250 miles an hour. The streamlined fighters with noses down go right on past us and pick up speed toward 400 miles an hour. But these Japanese would not give up. They were zeros, and that means they were very clean jobs. But the pilots put their flaps down, dropped their landing gear, and did everything they could to keep their speed slow. Nevertheless, they would go on past us, but that did not keep them out either. They would pull up, do a zooming chandelle, and come right back into fire at the next planes diving past. The commander added that the result was a terrific free-for-all. The Zeros stayed with us right down to the water. Naturally, we went for the carrier first. It was obvious we had caught them by surprise. In the dive, I could see a number of planes on deck, and one was coming up from the interior hangar deck in the elevator. When we first saw the Japanese, Dixon continued, the carrier was steaming downwind. It immediately made a sharp turn to the port, trying to get back into the wind to launch its planes. I could see it all clearly as I peered through my telescopic sight, lining myself up for the bomb release. A dozen or more pilots told of that fighting dive the scouts made that day. Imagine a huge cascade 15,000 feet in height, with every few seconds a mighty salmon flashing down its course. Our dive-bombing pilots were following just such a track, almost like salmon flashing over an immense waterfall. They were changing formation at the top echelon, which means they were stringing out one behind the other. They would then push off, each man following his leader or taking his own special target during the approximate 40-second interval between the commencement of the descent and the recovery after dropping their bombs 1,000 feet above the water. The Japanese fighters, to give them their due, were tenaciously battling, even during the 40-second dives, to distract the pilots throughout this aiming period. Often there would be a chain of diving planes with a scout bomber at the bottom, a Zero just above him, a second scout bomber on the Zero's tail, with a second Zero above the second scout. Above that, there would be other similarly mingled chains of Japanese fighters and our scouts. The Japanese ships around the carrier had thrown up a heavy curtain of bursting shells from their anti-aircraft guns. All the planes, scouts, Zeros, and our heavy dive bombers, which by now were coming down from about 16,000 feet, went right through the shell curtain, in most cases without ever knowing it. Our pilots' eyes were glued to their sights, and our rear gunners in both the scouts and heavy dive bombers were firing at the Zeros. The Japanese probably were equally intent, for they were using their 20mm cannon and machine guns every time they were lined up, even momentarily, on one of our planes. Some of our fighters, sitting up at 16,000 feet, where they were protecting the last of the dive bombers at their most vulnerable point, a few seconds before they turn over in their dive, reported that Commander Dixon's dive was perfectly made. They saw his 500-pound bomb, the first one dropped, hit the Japanese carrier amidships, wrecking the flight deck and preventing the launching of any of the planes still aboard. Right behind Dixon followed Ensign P.F. Neely, whose 500-pounder hit near the carrier's port side. It was a near miss, but the blast from this bomb tossed 2 burning planes from the carrier's decks into the sea. The third bomber, flown by Ensign Smith, scored a direct hit on the carrier's starboard anti-aircraft battery. The explosion of this bomb silenced this group of guns and blew 3 more planes overboard. The fourth bomber, flown by Ensign J.A. Lepler, was one of those attacked by the Zeros almost as soon as his dive steepened to the near vertical. His rear gunner, John Lisker, facing backwards and firing his twin .30 caliber machine guns, fought off this particularly persistent attack. In a duel with 2 of the Zeros that quickly overhauled the Scout and closed to point-blank range, firing their cannon, Lisker got hits that caused flames to burst from their fuel tanks. Both these Zeros crashed into the sea. Ensign Lepler was busy during his dive too. He saw a Zero go on past him and begin shooting at Smith's plane. Easing out of his dive slightly, Lepler got the Zero into his sights and shot that one down also. The carrier was well into its turn, by that time arid. Besides, Lepler had been distracted. The best he could do with his 500-pounder was to lay it close beside the carrier in a near miss. This, however, did not satisfy him. He zoomed away, climbed back to 4,000 feet and dive-bombed one of the Japanese cruiser escorts with both his 100-pounders. One of these hit the cruiser on the stern, which invariably is the target at which dive-bombers aim their bombs. But let us return to this dive, which was completed by the entire Scout Squadron in less time than it takes you to read these few paragraphs. Ensign O.J. Schultz, 5th in line in that attack, secured a hit on the carrier with his bomb, but was attacked by 4 Zero fighters as he recovered from his dive. His rear gunner, whose name I never learned but who was, you may be sure, as much a hero as any of the pilots, broke up the attack by shooting one down and making it so hot for the others that they turned away. When that plane got back to the carrier, 29 bullet holes were counted in it, but neither pilot nor gunner was wounded. The Scouts' dives had taken away the enemy's fighter protection aloft, and the heavier dive bombers with 1,000-pounders in their belly rack had little opposition as they delivered their attacks. But the 2 or 3 minutes during which the Scouts were attacking had enabled the Japanese fleet to spread out so that each vessel would have plenty of water in which to maneuver and to get their heaviest anti-aircraft guns into action. Coordinated with the commencement of the heavy dive bomber attack was Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Brett's torpedo squadron attack. The Zeros that had survived the battle with the Scouts during the dive now stayed down on the sea and flew out to intercept the torpedo planes, now making their final approaches. "Hey, fighters, come and get these Zeros off me," Brett radioed to our Grumman pilots, as the first of the Japanese began playing leapfrog across the torpedo planes now fanned out almost in a squadron front formation. Lieutenant Baker and his wingman, whose contribution to the battle up to that point had been the downing of a Japanese seaplane fighter, answered Brett's call. In 2 runs they shot down 2 Zeros and held off the rest to free the torpedo formation. The first of the heavy dive bombers, which we left a moment ago just starting their dives, was piloted by Lieutenant Commander Hamilton. Ham had been over-carried by the wind in his dive at a Japanese cruiser at Salamaua, and had vowed before he started his flight that morning of the 7th that he would get a bullseye. "My ambition in life is to put my big bomb clean through the deck and into the vitals of the biggest Japanese carrier I can find," Ham had been telling all of us in the wardroom mess. Hamilton did just what he wanted, Paul Ramsey later said. "I watched his dive and saw that he plunked his bomb into the exact center of the flight deck, just slightly abaft of midships. There was a tremendous explosion. Flames seemed to leap 400 feet into the air." Another fighter pilot, Lieutenant Commander Flatley, skipper of Carrier 2's fighters, told me later, "I was sitting upstairs at 5,000 feet watching them come down." The heavy bond began exploding fit 3 and 4 second intervals. Fire, flames and seawater were being thrown hundreds of feet high from each explosion. The 1,000-pound bombs seemed to be pattering down like rain, and those big babies do 4 times as much damage as the 500-pounders. The sight of those heavy bombs smashing that carrier was so awful it gave me a sick feeling. Every second bomb was landing and exploding aboard the ship. Those powerful blasts were literally tearing the big ship apart. She burst into flames from bow to stern. I do not see how anybody aboard that ship could have survived. While this split-second action was going on, Commander Brett, now free of the fighters, was dropping his own fish. He is a wily one. He used the smoke pouring out of the wounded Japanese to screen his squadron's approach. They sneaked in from downwind under the smoke. When so close they could not miss, they made an S-turn, so that their torpedoes finally dropped full into the starboard side of their victim. The Navy's remarkable photographs of this action show exactly how this was done, and in many of these pictures Brett's planes can be seen following his trail. One after another, these deadly fish zipped in and blasted against the carrier's hull. 12 actual torpedo hits were scored, literally tearing the whole side out of the vessel. Almost at the same time, 16 bombs of the 1,000-pound size, plus 3 500-pounders, were slamming into her from above. The result was that this vessel disappeared in a giant cloud of smoke and steam, almost as if a giant's heel had crunched her beneath the surface. Back on the Lexington, all of us were anxious to know the results of the attack. We were confident the squadrons would do a good job, but this was, after all, the first such attack ever made on a carrier by American crews. In the radio room we could hear some of the pilots talking, but static was bad and much of it was inaudible. By watching the clock, we knew they must have gone into action, and our natural anxiety was heightened by this knowledge. All the tension on the carrier exploded the moment we heard Commander Dixon's voice come in strong and clear. "Scratch 1 flat top." Dixon to carrier. "Scratch 1 flat top." It meant that the Navy could scratch 1 more Japanese flat-top carrier off the lists of the enemy's fleet. In other words, the boys had done the job and the carrier was sunk, news which brought forth resounding cheers and applause throughout the ship from stem to stern and keel to truck. All this action happened in such short order, and the results were so final that there were pilots in both the torpedo and dive-bomber squadrons who arrived too late to get a crack at the carrier at all. One torpedo plane, for instance, saw the carrier was finished and made off after a cruiser. One of his squadron mates who had dropped his fish against the carrier saw this boy and guessed his intention. The unarmed torpedo bomber joined up with the craft that still had its torpedo, and both planes ran in as if making the attack together. Of course it was a dry run for the pilot who had no torpedo, but it was not merely a bit of bravado. I saw the report this pilot made when he got back to us safely. It read, "I went along to draw some of the anti-aircraft fire which otherwise might have been concentrated too heavily on just one plane." Unfortunately, the reports do not show that this torpedo hit its mark. The gunnery officer from Carrier 2 was a rear-seat passenger with one of the scout planes that day. He had gone over to watch the effect of heavy bombs on warships, and after the carrier had sunk beneath his gaze, he was astounded to see a heavy cruiser, which was down by the stern, turn over and sink. His attention had been fixed on the carrier, and he had seen no attack on any other ship in the Japanese fleet. When he arrived back on his carrier, all the other planes had returned. The first thing this officer did was to ask which pilot or pilots had sunk the cruiser. No one seemed to know what he was talking about, but there was one way to find out: go through the individual pilot reports. You see, when an airman is given a bomb or a torpedo on a raid like this, he is expected to tell just what he did with it when he comes back. These things cost the United States taxpayer a lot of money, and flyers are not supposed to go off and just drop them anywhere without telling anybody. A search through Carrier 2's pilot reports failed to disclose any mention of an attack on a cruiser. The Lexington's reports were combed with the same result, except for Ensign Lepler's 100-pounder, which could not possibly have achieved this. All the air control officers by now were interested in the case, and all the men who had taken part in the raid were called up in both ships and asked if they had seen anyone hit a cruiser with either a bomb or torpedo. Finally, a young ensign went to his squadron commander and said, "I am terribly sorry, sir. I am the one who did it. I started to bomb the carrier but could see she was sinking. While I was flying around wondering which ship to give my bomb to, this cruiser started to shoot at me. So I said, 'Right then, I will give it to you. So I did. It was only a cruiser, and I did not think that worthwhile reporting. This boy's attitude is typical of all the pilots, who realize better than anyone else that if they can exterminate the carriers in an enemy force, and so destroy its air defense and offense, they destroy the fighting power of that fleet. The rest of the vessels may be picked off at leisure. When Commander Dixon got back to the Lexington, I questioned him about the fight. His main concern was for the safety of two in his squadron, Lieutenant Edward Allen and Ensign A.J. Quigley. Allen, a particularly close friend who won the Navy Cross on February 20th by his 200-mile pursuit of a Japanese land-based bomber at the Battle of Bougainville, was hit by anti-aircraft fire in his bombing dive, and his plane went into the water. We were able to give him better news about Quigley because the ensign had been in touch with the ship by radio. He had been attacked by a Japanese Zero which scored a lucky hit on his left aileron, damaging it so badly that his aileron control was virtually nil. He attempted to make the trip back to the carrier, but after getting as far as Rossall, he reported that he would have to land. We had asked him at that time if he could not continue on to the carrier, which was then not far away. He replied, "Afraid not, my fuel supply is giving out." The skipper told Quigley that Rossall Island was the best place for him to land, and that everything would be done to pick up him and his radio man, R.E. Wheelhouse. Some joker in a plane piped in to tell Quigley to watch out for those brown-skinned beauties, and the last word we had from him was a cheerful, "Tell the boys we are going to do a stretch of beachcombing." Quigley and Wheelhouse were rescued 18 days afterward by a small Australian warship which was making a methodical patrol of the islands in this area, searching for marooned American flyers. Quigley described his experiences later while recovering in the Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital from malaria. He made a high-speed landing inside a reef off Rossall Island. "I was stunned a little," he said, "but the water coming in revived me. We got the rubber boat out and I took the chart board. We rowed for 45 minutes, but got nowhere because the current was too strong, then saw an outrigger and 3 of the wildest-looking natives you can imagine." Despite their looks, the natives took them ashore to the house of the local missionary, also a native, where they were the centre of interest for some days. Quigley spent some time aboard with the Australians while they continued their rescue work. "They almost drove me crazy," he said. One day they steamed up to a harbour which was reported to be full of Japanese seaplanes. We were to support some Allied aircraft in attacking the enemy inside. Somehow the air attack force did not show up, but the young Australian commander decided to steam into the port anyway and get after the Japanese. The little ship dashed into the harbour, but the enemy had left, so there was no fight. Commander Hamilton got back to the carrier with his engine vibrating severely and with bullet holes in his propeller, drilled by bullets from his own guns. He told the story this way. "As I came through the anti-aircraft pattern and released my bomb, inadvertently I squeezed the Mickey Mouse, the gun and bomb release trigger, a little too hard and my guns fired. Of course, at the time I did not know this, but the plane began to vibrate violently, and I assumed I had been hit by Japanese fire. I throttled back as I pulled out and found I could amble along home at reduced speed. I took a look to see where I had been hit as soon as I landed. Only then did I find that the synchronization gear on one gun had slipped and the prop was perforated by my own slugs. As the planes started to return, we could see by the way some of them were flying that they had been damaged. And as they came into the landing circle, I saw tears in their metal skins that later proved to be cannon-shot holes in wings and tail fins on several of the ships. One came in asking to land out of his turn, and the ship's physician, always on duty on the flight deck, was waved up onto the plane. And as this plane was taxied into parking position, the doctor was standing on the wing cutting away the shirt of the rear gunner, who had been drilled through his upper left lung. They put him into the special Navy wire stretcher and carried him below. The Lexington's first man wounded in action. Practically everyone else in the squadrons had routine flights back to the carrier, except Ensign Lepler and his gunner D.K. Lisker. These two who already had accounted for 3 zeros in this battle. And remember, they were flying in a comparatively slow scout bomber which should have been cold meat to any fighter, had flown about half the 180 miles of the homeward trek when they spotted a Japanese seaplane fighter. It was then several miles off their course and interfering with no one. but to these two boys, a Japanese is a Japanese wherever he is. Lepla turned after the seaplane and rapidly overhauled it. The Japanese was waiting for them, and he too was a two-seater. The result was a short but violent air duel that ended when the Japanese plane crashed into the sea. It gave Lepla and Liska a day's total of 4. When their plane finally alighted on the Lexington, all of us went out and walked around it, examining it closely. Parts of it looked like my wife's colander. There were bullet holes in the wings, fuselage, the tail, and the ailerons. It must have whistled a cheerful tune as the wind whipped through these holes while flying. The other pilots wondered how and why it answered to the controls. Its return at all is a testimonial to the builders of the ship and engine. When I looked into the cockpit, I found that other shots had gone through the plexiglass cockpit covers, missed the pilot and gunner by inches, and then completely smashed some of the instrument board. One bullet tore the heel off the pilot's right shoe, and another, after coming through the plane and buzzing round the cockpit like a bee, to quote Lepla, went through the leg of his flying suit and was found stuck in the knee of his trousers. Our pilots were home in time for lunch, which turned into a celebration. There was a good deal of satisfaction over many things. First, the destruction of the enemy carrier and all the aircraft aboard her at the time, the sinking of a heavy cruiser, and the shooting out of the air of 17 aircraft. All of this had been accomplished for the loss of 3 SBDs, the Douglas scout bombers, the crew of 1, Quigley and his gunner, being saved. Another important point for all the airmen was the fact that they had encountered the vaunted Zero and found that even scout bombers could handle it. The fighters got little chance at the Zeros, which went down with the dive bombers and stayed down to hit at the torpedo planes. Only 2 Zeros, as a matter of fact, were credited to the fighters, the rest going to dive bombers, torpedo planes, and scouts. The weather deteriorated rapidly as we turned southward that afternoon. We got into rain squalls, low scud, and some fog. Visibility was at times 0, and at others lifted to only several miles. Tricky flying weather in which carrier pilots work hard and run the risk of losing their carrier. As we moved along, I spent the afternoon talking with Commander Bill Alt, who had gone over that morning in command of the Lexington group. The failure of the Japanese anti-aircraft to take a higher toll of our planes was very gratifying. Their shooting, I thought, was quite good. He then said that when he flew in toward the carrier at a height of 10,000 feet, he approached a cruiser steaming away. This vessel's batteries opened on him with all guns, and the shell bursts were so close, the plane was bounced around and violently jerked about so that the control stick was slapped around in his hand. I made a gentle turn round this cruiser, and the ship turned with me so that it kept broadside on all the time. This way it was able to hold every gun on me. The bursts from these guns stayed with me until I was out of range. Miraculously, the plane was not hit, though the shooting could hardly have been better. Late that afternoon, with the early twilight of a rainy day beginning to descend, Ramsey, who then was aloft on a fighter patrol, radioed that he had sighted 9 Zero fighters almost over the fleet in the rain. He added that he was going to attack, although he had only 3 other planes with him. His voice was coming to us in the wardroom through a big radio placed there and constantly tuned in on the fighter frequencies. We heard him talking to his wingman and to the second pair of fighters in his group. "Do you see them? There are 5 in the leading V, then 2 with 2 trailing. George, you take the center 2, and I will take the last 2. Have you got it? We will deal with the others later. Let us go and get them." There was silence for a while, and then we heard another voice, that of Jimmy Flatley from Carrier 2. He evidently had heard Ramsey's report and had joined in. After some indistinguishable chatter, we heard Paul ask, "How many did you get, Jimmy?" "I got 3. How many did you get, Paul?" came the reply. "Only 2, darn it," Ramsey replied in a voice dripping with disappointment. In this battle, fought in the rain from 5,000 feet right down to water level, Ramsey told me later he once found himself only 30 feet off the ocean. The boys in their Grummons had shot down 7 out of the enemy 9. Lieutenant Baker, who had shot down 2 Zeros and a seaplane in the morning, failed to return. His wingman, Ensign Edward Selstrom, said that Baker shot down 1 Zero and then appeared to collide with another which burst into flame. Both the ships then crashed. By a strange coincidence, another fighter pilot, also named Baker, was lost in this same engagement. This pilot came out of the fight safely, but because our carriers were by now in heavy rain and almost complete darkness, he was having difficulty locating us. He was from the fighter command of Carrier 2, but we were listening on the fighter frequency and could clearly hear him asking directions and the assistance which both Carrier 2 and our own fighter control were attempting to give in order to get him back safely. For more than an hour we stood around listening to this very real drama. Dinner was wafting in the wardroom mess, but nobody cared to dine until this young flyer had been brought aboard. Finally, after more than an hour with his fuel supply nearly exhausted, he said he could see land below him, evidently one of the islands in the neighbourhood. We judged that he had flown north again out of the thick weather and back perhaps toward the Louisiade. The last radio report was his announcement that he was going to alight on this land. I have still not learned the fate of this boy. A group of us were standing on the flight deck following dinner when we saw the final, most amazing sight of this very full day. It came without warning when we heard a drone of aircraft engines in the murk overhead. Out of the rain squall on one quarter flew a formation of 9 bombers that came right across the fleet only mast high. The leader picked out the Lexington, turned our way and flashed on his navigation lights. Every other ship followed suit, and they strung out like a flight of tired birds coming home to roost, one officer remarked. The leader flew into the landing circle and began flashing his identification signal. It happened that there was some similarity between the identification he used and our own. Knowing we had only one plane then in the air, we were momentarily taken aback. At that moment, our missing scout returned, seeing the stranger's navigation lights, started shooting. We could see the sparks of his tracer as he fired at the last of the line. This was sufficient signal for the escort destroyers to open fire. The Japanese, who had mistaken the Lexington for their own carrier, doused their lights and made off, disappearing almost as quickly as they had come into the blackness of the night. I have often wondered since what would have happened had we allowed them to make a landing. As one of the boys said, "Heck, this ocean must be crowded with aircraft carriers." He was speaking with more perspicacity than he realized, for our scout followed the direction taken by the enemy ships and a short time later saw them being taken aboard a carrier only 30 miles away. This scout, directed home to the Lexington by radio, told us there was a large enemy force with ships everywhere just over the horizon from us. He said he thought there were 2 carriers, but there might be more. With this information, we knew the Japanese unquestionably were warned and perhaps hunting us through the darkness. For a time, we were wondering if Admiral Fletcher would use his tight force of excellent cruisers and destroyers for a night attack. There was some speculation on this, but it never developed. There was always a chance, of course, that the 2 fleets would run into each other before morning, so the gunners on the ship were kept on the alert all night. There we were, 2 powerful air-striking forces within 30 miles of one another, wrapped in the invisibility lent by a rainy night. All of us felt that morning would bring a momentous day. In our enemy we recognized a tough, fanatical foe whose courage and cunning could not be discounted. Our forces appeared about equal. It seemed to be a question of who would get the first blow home. We had seen on the previous day what aircraft could do to a carrier, and so we knew the consequences that day might bring. All of us felt that with daylight would come the world's first battle between 2 strong aircraft carrier forces, each being aware of the other's presence, so the surprise element was out. And all of us felt that history was in the making as our vessels groped through the inky night. Commander Mort Seligman, the Lexington's executive officer, brought with him to sea practically all his worldly goods, except his house. With his civilian clothing, his golf clubs, fishing tackle, etc., he also had on board a superb combination recording and playback machine. We often discussed the value of interviews with pilots, air commanders, and air crewmen recorded on discs as a permanent record. Taken immediately after the men return from action while their impressions are still vivid and clear, such recordings would be of great value to supplement their written reports, which often are laconic, stereotyped, and brief. We had been so enthused over the idea that the commander arranged for me to assist as questioner in his cabin on the night of the 7th. He invited, for the experiment, all the commanders of the air squadrons that took part in the day's attack on the Japanese carrier, later identified as the Ryukaku. Those who were present that evening after the air conferences were over, and plans for the 8th had been laid, were Group Commander Bill Alt, Lieutenant Commanders Ramsey, Brett, Hamilton, and Dixon. My part was to see they were properly introduced for the recording with Commander Seligman acting as the recording engineer, and to ask a question now and then to get them talking. We wanted everything they could remember about what each man saw and did in the fight. All of them were skilled observers, reporting about jobs in which each was an expert. What they had to say was precise and to the point. It was without frills of any sort, and just about the most dramatic thing I ever heard. From their flying grandstands above, these 5 men were eyewitnesses to everything that took place and was interwoven into the battle itself. As each man finished his own statement, he made a summary accounting for his squadron, and then added his conclusions concerning tactics. They also gave their evaluation of enemy movements and defensive action, described and summed up the strength and weaknesses of enemy pilots, planes, anti-aircraft guns, and vessels. I believe that had these recordings been preserved and sent on to Washington as Commander Seligman hoped and intended, they would have been of the greatest value to the Navy's staff, personnel, and procurement sections. They would, in my opinion at least, have been of truly material benefit as supplemental to the paper reports that already go in on every phase of any action. We played the 4 discs, each one of about 20 minutes playing time, back for ourselves that night. So good were they that Seligman and I decided to attempt to make a recording the next day of any fighting that might take place around us. We were anticipating an air attack on the Lexington and Carrier too, almost as soon as it was light, so there was real point to the preparations we then made. Earlier experiments along the same line had been unsatisfactory because the recording microphone had picked up too much noise from the ship itself. The rattle and slam of gunfire on the Lexington's flight deck alone had been enough to jam the mic and create a noise level over which it was impossible to talk. So we taped the microphone so that by cupping my hands over it and holding it close to my lips, we could exclude almost any other sound and yet get a clear recording of the voice itself. We extended the microphone lines from the commander's cabin up to the signal bridge, my battle station, and had about 40 feet of loose line there to enable me to move freely around the bridge and see everything that might happen. One of the orderlies was shown how to operate the recording machine. We rigged an intercommunications telephone between the bridge and his cabin so that he could be given directions when to start and stop the turntable. By the time all this was arranged, it was after midnight. The other officers had long since turned in. I wandered around the Lexington's quarters for a time, being too uncomfortably hot to sleep. The only light I found was in the cabin of Commander Brett, who was busy tapping away on a typewriter. He looked up, smiled, and invited me in to show me the manuscript of a book on colour photography he had almost completed after 2 years of work. He explained he already had published 1 book on the subject, and his 2nd volume was covering particularly wartime applications for colour film. He hoped it would be of some value to the services, and believed that when this cruise was over he would be ready to send it to the publishers. I finally left him and got to typing myself, getting my notes in order and doing rough dispatches to cover the action to date. I finally fell asleep at 4 a.m. So exhausted was I that when the pre-dawn battle station's call came at 5:30, I just rolled over and dug into the pillow again, but the clang, clang, clang of the scouts going off finally roused me, and suddenly I was wide awake. I had just remembered there was a very good reason for getting up this morning. There were Japanese round and about us, and a battle in the offing. One becomes so weather-conscious on a carrier that I had gotten into the habit of climbing up to the flight deck for a look around before going down to breakfast. A peek out the island's exit showed me a beautiful, clear morning with the sun sparkling just over the horizon. It was a marvellous day, exactly the kind everyone in the fleet would have gladly done without, for an aircraft carrier, like a plane in enemy territory, is safest when it is running through fog and heavy rain squalls. It turned out that the Lexington remained in clear weather throughout the hours of daylight. It was the Japanese who had the position of advantage, for their fleet was in ideal carrier weather. It was running from one patch of low scud and rain to another all day long. It had these natural curtains to hide in, and its ships split up most skillfully to take all the benefits the weather afforded. There had been every likelihood that the 2 fleets would be close together at dawn. It could have been possible that they might be almost within sight of us, and we of them. We of the Lexington stood to general quarters in all departments, ready to bounce into action the minute our scouts took the air just before daylight. Maybe they would find the enemy in their first 15 minutes of flying. If that was the case, the battle would go to the force that struck the earliest blow. We intended to be that force. 15 minutes, 30 minutes, then an hour went by and none of the scouts reported a thing. They had flown out from the ship in all directions like spokes of a wheel radiating from the hub. After that first hour, we relaxed somewhat on the ship and got a good breakfast under our collective belts. It was not until 8:10 that Ensign Smith, one of the scouts who had gone out due northeast, radioed a contact report. He had completed the full limit of his 225-mile outbound course, had flown his 90-degree cross-leg and 25 miles of his return course when he sighted the enemy. 2 carriers, 4 heavy cruisers, many destroyers, steering 120 degrees, 20 knots. Their position 175 miles, roughly northeast, he reported. It was the information we had been seeking. Pilots went to their ready room and the deck crews began warming up the motors. The whole ship was alert, and a few minutes later orders came down from the bridge to put the ship into condition Z. This is the order given just before the commander really anticipates battle. It means that every watertight door and hatch is bolted down. In the Lexington, this divided the ship off into some 600 separate air compartments which made her virtually unsinkable. All over the ship I could hear crews slamming shut watertight doors and dogging them down with clamps which held them in place and would resist the enormous pressures of outside seawater should the hull be holed near them. Steel hatches separating the decks were battened down by tightening more than 40 steel nuts and bolts that held the edges. Cut into each hatch is a round hole. The Navy calls this a scuttle, large enough to allow a man to dip through. Each hole has a top with a large wheel that operates a threaded screw. This enables the scuttle to be opened to allow a man through and closed again behind him. In Condition Z, there is a guard for every door and scuttle. There was no more word from Smith, but Commander Dixon, who had been flying a scouting segment adjoining Smith's, heard the pilot's radio and flew over to see for himself in the hope of giving assistance. Within a very few minutes he was at the position where Smith reported the Japanese. Dixon could not find them. He began quartering the area, which was full of unusually woolly clouds hanging low. Under some of them was a veil of heavy rain. These vapor pillars filled the sky to overflowing, without, however, making a solid layer. Dixon found that some of the mist and rain made visibility 0 right on the sea and extended up as high as 6,000 feet. Looking for a fleet in there was like looking for a deer in a forest. Suddenly he saw them slipping across a clear spot, and he began amplifying Smith's reports at once. Also, he corrected the position as given, announcing that they were 200 miles away from us. He saw 2 carriers, 5 cruisers, and at least 7 destroyers. And most important of all, he stayed within sight of the enemy, circling overhead, slipping into and out of the clouds, and continued sending radio direction signals to guide our air squadrons, which he assumed were already on their way to attack. But Dixon was wrong on that point. Our attack squadrons, although ready to go, were still aboard. Admiral Fletcher evidently was awaiting word from the rest of the scouts before committing himself fully in any one direction. He was waiting to be sure there were no other Japanese fleets within the scouting circle around us. This is a logical precaution, almost a military necessity, but the pilots were chafing under the delay. They wanted to get off and trap the Japanese still on their carriers, before the Japanese could make a pass in our direction. This, of course, left Dixon in a spot. Alone, without support of any kind, he soon was discovered by enemy air patrols. Dozens of Zeros were in the air, and one after another they began making feints at him. He avoided as many as possible by diving into clouds, but could not, of course, avoid them all. He had many brushes and did some firing, but naturally was evading combat. His job was to stay alive and hold on to the Japanese fleet. He did it superbly, for he remained hovering over and around them for 2 hours and 50 minutes. This was an hour longer than the time he expected our attack force would require to reach there. He finally had to start back because his fuel was getting dangerously low, and he had still 200 miles to fly. In its own quiet way, typical of Bob Dixon, this lone vigil was one of the most heroic bits of work done by any man in the war. Imagine it. A lone scout holding its own over 2, we now believe possibly 3 Japanese carriers, big carriers full of the best fighting planes and pilots the Japanese possessed. The airplane Dixon flew was a Douglas SBD. This is a good craft, but definitely not a fighter. A standard Navy reference book says that this two-plane weighs 7,400 pounds, has a 41.5-foot wingspan, a top speed of 260 miles an hour, and cruises at 210. Against it, the Japanese were using their vaunted Zeros. This is a single-seater plane with a top speed of better than 350 miles an hour, and is armed with two 20mm cannon and 2.25 caliber machine guns. Furthermore, it is one of the most maneuverable fighting planes in the air, and with all this, plus numerical advantages, should have been able to knock down Dixon's aircraft without any trouble at all. Nevertheless, Dixon not only managed to stay in the air, he got home safely. "How in the world, Bob, did you manage to survive?" I asked him. "When you started home and maintained radio silence for an hour and a half, we became very concerned." "We ducked in and out of the clouds," he answered, grinning a little. "When they came after us," he had a rear gunner in the Scout with him, "they did not press their attacks home. They seemed to prefer to make feinting runs, evidently hoping to get my rear gunner to use up his belts of ammunition so they could close in while he was reloading. My gunner refused to play this game and held his fire until they were within slaying range. If they came in too close, I would make a steep turn and head toward them with one wing low. This allowed me to be in shooting position with my front guns and also permitted my gunner to fire forward over the wing with his twin flexible mounted guns." Bob's long stay had helped us immeasurably. The weather was so rotten over the Japanese fleet that it might have been easy for all our squadrons to have missed them. As it was, he stayed, not knowing whether our groups were coming or not, until only 15 minutes before the first units arrived. His signals, given out until he started home, guided them practically to the goal, and made the search at the end very easy. It was not until after 9 o'clock that Admiral Fletcher was satisfied he should launch all his planes at the fleet Dixon had been covering. The word to go came through. The pilots hurriedly copied their navigation information off the ready-room blackboards and ran to their planes. The first ones to depart lifted into the air about 9:30 a.m. Ahead of them was a flight of approximately an hour and 20 minutes. They were enemy-bound. The Lexington sent an attack force of 12 torpedo planes, 9 dive bombers, 9 fighters, and 4 scout bombers who were Group Commander Ault's command force. Carrier 2 sent off 9 torpedo planes, 24 dive bombers, and 6 fighters. This time there were no bombers carrying less than 1,000-pounders. In all they totaled 73 aircraft, 21 torpedo planes, 37 dive bombers, 15 fighters. On the Lexington we learned just after the last of our planes got away that 1 hour earlier a Japanese scout had sighted us and escaped. This meant, of course, that the Japanese knew where we were, our strength, and our course and speed. We did not doubt, after this word came through, that we would be the targets for a similar air attack group to the one we had sent away ourselves. Our planes did not form one huge air fleet. The Lexington's dive bombers climbed high, above 14,000 feet, accompanied by 4 Grumman fighters. The command force of 4 scout bombers had 2 fighters as escorts, and 3 fighters went with the Lexington's dive bombers. 4 fighters had been scheduled to go, but the 4th plane's tail was damaged by a propeller on deck as it was taxiing out to take off. Carrier 2's 6 fighters were distributed among the torpedo plane squadrons and bombers from that vessel. With all these planes flying in separate formations, the 73 aircraft were split into 5 subdivisions. This became important later on, because the 9 dive bombers from the Lexington missed the Japanese entirely in the fog and rain and took no part in the attack. These divisions also meant that the units were separated in time by intervals of from 5 to 10 minutes. When halfway to the target, the 3 fighters escorting the Lexington's dive bombers lost contact with their charges and returned to the carrier. This probably was just as well, because these fighters then took part in the desperate defense of the ship, which began about the time they showed up. To describe this involved action in which time, height, and space separations are so important, let us choose, at random, Commander Brett's torpedo group from the Lexington. They climbed to 6,000 feet and droned along unhurriedly, which was the only way their heavily laden TBDs would fly anyhow. Part way along the route, one plane turned back. Its engine was giving trouble, oil pressure was dropping, and the cylinder head temperatures soaring, so the commander ordered the pilot home to the Lexington. They went on, the other 11. Escorting them were Lieutenant Noel Gaylor and a wingman whose name I do not know, and Ensign H.F. Clark with another wingman whose name I do not have. All four were flying fighters. Cloud conditions developed as they approached the area where the enemy fleet was steaming, and very soon after they began to clip along through the tops of these piled clouds, they were intercepted by some wide-ranging Japanese fighters. These were Zeros, forming the outer defensive screen for the enemy. While the torpedo planes ducked into the clouds, the fighters engaged the enemy. Gaylor said afterward the intention was merely to distract the Zeros for a moment, but the quartet quickly found itself in a life-and-death duel because Zeros seemed to materialize from all directions and clung to the Grummans tenaciously. In a few seconds they were turning, firing and turning again to keep the Japanese from shooting them down. It was an unequal combat, but Gaylor, the sole American survivor, afterwards said he believed that the other 3 men in his group got at least 1 Japanese each. In the maneuvering and in the clouds they lost sight of each other. The boys whose names I have not been able to get were never heard from again. Clark sometime later radioed that his plane was badly shot up and he was being forced to alight at sea. We all hoped that the landing was successfully made and that he was able to get his little yellow rubber dinghy inflated. If he was able to get into the dinghy, he had a good chance of being blown to one of the nearby islands by the prevailing southeasterly wind. Gaylor, in telling of this action, later said, "This swarm of Zeros kept me in defense maneuvers constantly. There was always one of them making a run at me. Early in the scrap I evaded the attack of one and then jumped his tail. He immediately resorted to the old Zero trick of zooming for altitude. Remember, those babies will climb 4,000 feet a minute. They just love to have you on their tail trying to follow them up. If you do, they climb out of your range, flop over backward at the top of their zoom, and you suddenly find them diving back at you when you are almost stalled and easy meat." I anticipated the pull-up and gave him a snap burst as he commenced his climb. My bullets hit him and he began to burn. I ducked into a cloud at once to evade the swarm again. They kept me in there for a couple of minutes. I would duck out one side and they would be there waiting. I would climb to the top and find them up there. I would go out the bottom and run into some more. That cloud was home to me. Finally, I came out one side, saw a Japanese below me. The Japanese saw me and made that instinctive pull-up right in front of my guns. I gave it to him, and he too burned. That ended the fight, and Gaylor started after the torpedo group. He said he came out over the enemy fleet and through a hole in the cloud saw a carrier blazing furiously from end to end. He decided the attack was over, and so turned back on his course, looking down close to the water for the torpedo outfit. While his escorts were in desperate combat with the Zeros, Brett and his torpedo pilots went. They approached the target area in time to meet Commander Alt's 4-plane command unit. They joined up and started quartering the ocean because rain and clouds were hiding the Japanese ships. After 15 minutes of systematic search, they sighted a carrier. During the search, Commander Brett had been trying to make radio contact with the Lexington's 9 heavy dive bombers. Failing to raise them, Brett and Alt decided to carry on with the attack at once. Alt and his staff would do the dive bombing, coordinating their dives with Brett's more vulnerable, slow, low approach that he had to make in order to launch his torpedoes. This, too, was a gallant action. Every man flying in the 2 units knew that they were a very small force for the job in hand. The immunity the Lexington's squadrons had enjoyed in other actions arose in a large measure from the fact that there had been 70 to 80 planes attacking at once from all directions. This coordinated attack had the effect of confusing the enemy defences, spreading the anti-aircraft fire thin and disorganizing the fighter patrols. But this time the attack was to be made with 15 planes. Carrier 2's planes were somewhere around but hidden from Brett and Alt in poor weather. They had made no contact with the Lexington group, and furthermore might be off somewhere attacking an entirely different division of the Japanese fleet. This latter assumption proved correct, Brett learned later, and so they did not wait for more assistance. "We caught this carrier and her escort of cruisers and destroyers in the clear," Brett told later, discussing the attack. "We went over first at 3,500 feet, and there was no anti-aircraft fire. I judged that the Japanese mistook us for their own planes, which is an easy mistake to make, because theirs and ours are almost alike. They have copied us freely. At that moment, they were steaming hard toward the cover of a rain squall. Ensign N. Esteri in Brett's squadron explained the action in even more detail. The clouds ranged from 2,000 to 6,000 feet, and after the preparatory examination of the enemy disposition, the squadron leader dived for the attack position. We fanned out and headed in at high speed. This time we were recognized and met by heavy anti-aircraft fire, and a lot of Japanese fighters showed up but did not push their attacks home. Group Commander Bill Alt's 4 planes dived simultaneously with our torpedo run, all concentrated on the carrier. The Japanese went into a tight, constant turn when attacked. By the time it was my turn to drop, she already was smoking, showing evidence of having been hit. I dropped my fish on her starboard quarter 75 feet above the water, 500 yards out. At the time, I was being subjected to heavy anti-aircraft fire and attack from a fighter. As I was joining up with the main group, one of the boys who had not let go of his fish said he was going to attack a cruiser, so I accompanied him, making a dummy run to assist in absorbing the ship's anti-aircraft fire. At least 5 of Brett's 11 torpedoes socked home into this carrier. This total is the Navy's official record garnered from many pilots who saw it. While Brett's squadron was attacking, Bill Alt's dive bombers were making their dives and fortunately escaped most of the anti-aircraft fire because the carrier's batteries were busy with the torpedo planes. They were not molested in their swift, straight descents. The result was that 3 of their heavy bombs plunged through the carrier's decks. Towering masses of smoke and debris rose after each blast. The bombs seemed to act in a dual manner, one of the torpedo pilots who saw the dive bombers come down said afterward. Not only did they tear the carrier apart, but they also had an incendiary effect. Of course, that is not so strange. Carriers have huge tanks full of fuel oil and high-test gasoline. Once this starts to burn, it is goodbye. With their job done, the dive bombers and the torpedo bombers started home. The torpedo planes stayed right down on the sea and closed up in a tight defensive formation. A dozen Zeros hopped on them, and as Brett told me later, they approached first from our starboard quarter. My formation was so arranged that we could bring all of our rear guns to bear on these Japanese. As soon as the leader came within range, we shot him down. The rest pulled away, swung around astern of us, and made their approach from the port quarter. We repeated the performance, all 22 guns. They are in pairs, pumping shots into the leader. He fell burning. The rest, evidently impressed by our shooting, pulled away, and we were not molested again. But then we had other troubles. The long flight out, the search, the action, and the long flight home was extending us further than we should have been able to fly. We leaned our mixtures, slowed down, and trimmed for the most efficient angle of attack, to stretch our range to the utmost. During that whole last hour, I was virtually holding up my own and every other plane in that formation with my hands. Commander Alt and his 3 comrades climbed up and rejoined their 2-plane fighter escort as they started home. Before they had cleared the fleet area, they were attacked by more than 20 Zeros. The fighter pilots, Lieutenant Richard S. Bull and his wingman Ensign Bain, were both lost fighting hard to protect their charges. Then, one by one, the scouts were dropped, 3 of the 4 going down. The last we heard from Commander Alt, he reported by radio he was making a forced landing on the sea. He said his rear gunner was severely wounded, his plane badly shot up, and he himself had been struck by a bullet. When men go down like this, hopes are held that they can get ashore on some of the myriad islands in these seas. Many have done so. Although separated from the Lexington's groups, the torpedo and dive bomber planes from Carrier 2 were also busy. When they arrived where the Japanese were cruising, they too found a carrier. This one was part of a big fleet and undamaged, therefore obviously a different carrier than the one hit by the Lexington. What this division of our planes saw and did was told well by Lieutenant E.S. McCuskey, one of 4 fighters that escorted Carrier 2's unit of 9 torpedo planes. The other fighter pilots with McCuskey were Lieutenants Leonard and Woolen and Ensign Adams. They took off at 9:30 a.m., joined their formation, and had an uneventful flight to the bad weather area. We sighted the enemy at 11:30. They were steering a course of 180 degrees, speed 25 knots. As we approached, they were racing to get into the rain. We came round their port quarter at an altitude of 2,000 feet, our torpedo planes meanwhile flying down low. When the Japanese ships came into better view, I saw 3 battleships and 2 carriers, with a numerous accompanying screen of vessels. The Japanese opened anti-aircraft fire, and as the torpedo planes deployed for attack close to the sea, I could see big pillars of water being kicked up by salvos fired from the cruiser's main batteries. These must have been 6- and 8-inch guns, weapons ordinarily never used against aircraft. They were fired at the ocean surface so that a skip or burst would raise a column of water in front of a swift flying torpedo plane. Should a plane hit such a water column, it would be wrecked. 30 seconds later, I saw 3 Zeros above, preparing to attack. I closed up and overshot, flying on past Leonard, whom I was attempting to warn. The first Japanese dived on me from above and behind. I applied full throttle and made a steep climbing turn toward him. As he fired, his tracer zipped behind my plane. A few seconds later, I saw him pull up in front of me, smoke, hesitate, and then fall away in flames. Evidently, he had been hit by one of our fighters, I believe by Lieutenant Leonard. At the same time, I scissored another fighter who attacked, and his fire fell behind. As he climbed for another dive, I kicked my plane around, pulled up and shot 400 rounds into him. He did not attack but turned and staggered into a cloud with smoke trailing. About this time, another Zero attacked me from above. As I was almost at stalling speed, I took avoiding action by diving into a cloud. Entering it, I saw 3 other Zeros beneath me and astern. In the dive bomber group of Carrier 2 was Ensign J.H. Jorgensen, who took up where McCuskey dropped his story. As we circled over the enemy, we saw 2 carriers, 2 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and a number of destroyers that seemed to be opening out. They were doing 25 knots and spread over an area of sea, 5 miles long and 3 to 4 miles wide. At 11:34, our group dived on the starboard carrier. The squadron skipper, Lieutenant Commander William O. Birch, led and I followed. We dived and released below 2,000 feet. I saw the skipper's bomb hit flush on the carrier's deck amidships near the island. While closing my diving flaps as I pulled out, the plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire. It lurched and started into a left spin. After recovery, I saw a shell hole through my left aileron and wing. Fabric quickly ripped off and the wiring and tubing protruded. As I gained a climbing altitude, 3 fighters jumped my tail. Their bullets peppered the plane, especially the wings and front end of the fuselage. Some passed in over my right shoulder and tore the rear of my telescopic sight away. Others hit the back of the seat, and more came into the cockpit, wrecking most of my instruments. One bullet passed through the oxygen tube lying on my forearm, causing the tube to smoke. 3 bullets hit or grazed my right leg, and I got some shrapnel or powder burn in feet and toes. The plane flew very hard, the left wing being heavy. I flew through clouds and saw my radio man shoot down 1 fighter. 3 more attacked from ahead and above. One came in head-on, and I fired into him until he veered off smoking. After this attack, my engine began to lose power, missing on 1 or 2 cylinders. So I joined a group of SBDs, more dive bombers, and followed them home. Arriving, I tried to lower my wheels with my flaps down, but when I did this, the plane dropped off quickly. I then notified the carrier I was going to land in the water. I went into the sea near a destroyer, hit the water at 12:48 and was picked up at 12:52. The doctor aboard treated my leg. I desire to recommend Brunetti, my radio man, for shooting down an enemy fighter and for good work at all times. These are just samples of what happened to individual airmen with Carrier 2's groups. Collectively, they did a good job on the Japanese carrier on which they concentrated. It seemed that they ignored the port carrier of the 2 in sight, when first they arrived, and bent all their efforts on the starboard ship. The battleships were completely ignored as being not worth wasting bombs on until air opposition was destroyed. 7 of their 1,000-pound bombs and 4 torpedoes were rammed into the carrier, which was left burning. The least assumption from the damage done would be that this carrier was gutted by fire. There can be little doubt, however, that it was sunk. One of the most determined and gallant acts of the entire 5-day battle came during this engagement. Lieutenant John J. Powers, one of the pilots in our Carrier 2's dive-bombing group, had told his comrades he was going to put his big bomb into a Japanese carrier, come hell or high water. Powers' dive was watched by a number of other pilots who remembered what he had said. They related that he held his plane straight for the Japanese deck until he was down to 500 feet, point-blank range even for a dive bomber. There he released his bomb and commenced his recovery to normal flight. The big bomb, with its 700 pounds of high explosive, sped true to its mark. The resulting explosion shattered not only the Japanese ship, but also Power's plane, which had not cleared the blast area. "There is no question that John knew what he was doing," one of his fellow pilots told me. "He knew that if you go below about 700 feet in your recovery, the blast from a 1,000-pounder will get you every time. To stay above 700 feet means you must release your bomb not lower than 1,000 feet. He held his to 500 and was probably below 300 when the explosion came. He just decided not to miss, God bless him." The pilots told many more stories. Everyone was replete with more action, more thrills, and more destruction of planes than the wildest pulp magazine thriller ever dreamed up. But in this case everyone was true, and invariably they were told in the most self-effacing manner possible, by men who were proud of their flying mates, but mentioned their own deeds as impersonally as though they themselves had had nothing to do with them.